The cold bit through my jacket the moment I stepped off the beaten path. The Alaskan wilderness stretched out endlessly around me, an ocean of white, broken only by skeletal trees and jagged mountains clawing at the gray sky. I had planned this hike for months, craving the isolation, the rawness of nature that city life could never offer. But now, as the wind whispered strange, mournful sounds through the frozen pines, something gnawed at the edge of my mind, a feeling I couldn't shake. I'd been trekking for hours, each step crunching over brittle ice and snow, when I saw a small, dilapidated shack half buried in the drifts like some forgotten relic swallowed by time. It wasn't marked on any of my maps. The windows were cracked, frosted over, and the door hung crooked on its hinges. My gut screamed to keep moving, to disappear into the wilderness before night fell, but something pulled me closer, a morbid curiosity mixed with a creeping sense of dread. As I pushed open the door, the world seemed to hush. Inside, shadows clung to the walls, and the air was thick with a metallic chill that didn't belong to the cold outside. That's when I saw it. The frozen bodies. Dozens of them, huddled like forgotten prisoners of the ice, their faces pale and eyes wide with silent terror. My breath caught, and the floor seemed to tilt beneath me. What nightmare had unfolded here? And why was I the only one left to uncover it? The shack's secrets were buried deep in the frozen silence, but I knew this was only the beginning. Whatever had happened here, it was far from over. The frozen bodies stared at me from every corner, their lifeless eyes wide open as if frozen mid-scream. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure it echoed off the wooden walls. The air inside the shack was heavy, an unbearable mix of cold and something else, something foul and metallic that clung to my throat. I had to look closer, despite every instinct screaming at me to run. Most of the bodies were bundled in tattered winter gear, their fingers frozen stiff, faces locked in expressions of terror and pain. I could see frostbite had taken hold, but there was more. Bruises, deep purples and angry reds marred their skin, and some had their mouths gagged or tied. Whoever these people were, their suffering hadn't been natural. It was torture carved into flesh and frozen in time. I stumbled backward, desperate for air, and that's when I noticed a set of faded notes pinned to a wooden beam by the door. With trembling hands, I pulled them free. The paper was brittle, stained with blood and ice. The handwriting was jagged and frantic, filled with desperate pleas and warnings about something lurking in the woods, something hunting them. They mentioned the curse and the shadows that came at night, and how they tried to hide in this shack, but the cold was the least of their problems. My mind raced. These weren't just victims of nature or accident. They had been trapped. Here, hunted down by something cruel and merciless. I swallowed hard, feeling the cold seep deeper into my bones. Outside, the wind howled louder, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, waiting for whatever had done this to come for me next. As I stood there, shivering and overwhelmed, flashes of stories I'd heard before flickered. In my mind, the missing hikers, the unexplained disappearances, the whispered legends locals shared in hushed tones. My thoughts tangled with the icy air as memories of my own journey replayed. The strange silence that had fallen over the forest the moment I veered off the trail, the sudden chill that wasn't from the weather, the feeling that something was following me, just out of sight. I tried to piece it together to understand how this shack, this frozen tomb, tied into those disappearances. The note suggested a small expedition had come here weeks ago, researchers or hunters maybe, who'd underestimated the wilderness or something darker lurking beneath it. And now, here I was, trapped in the middle of their nightmare. The deeper I looked, the more the walls seemed to close in. I could almost hear whispers echoing off the frost-covered beams, the voices of those frozen in terror reaching out across time. My breath fogged the air as I crouched by one of the bodies, studying a shattered compass clenched in a stiff hand, a symbol of hope, lost to the ice. Outside, the forest was quiet, but the weight of solitude pressed down on me. I felt the creeping paranoia that had seized those who came before, the same isolation that had driven them to this cold prison. Was I next? I swallowed hard, the cold twisting in my gut, and forced myself to stand. I had to move. But the shack's secrets weren't done with me yet. The forest outside had fallen into a thick, oppressive silence, but inside the shack, something shifted. At first, it was just a flicker in the corner of my eye, a shadow darting behind a frost-cracked window. Then a low, dragging sound echoed from the floorboards beneath me, like nails scraping wood. My skin prickled, every hair standing on end. I wasn't alone. I gripped the edge of a broken table, trying to steady my shaking hands as the temperature plunged further, the cold seeping into my very bones. The shack groaned under the weight of unseen eyes, watching my every move. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the mind fueled by fear and exhaustion, but then a breath, ragged and wet, escaped somewhere in the darkness behind me. I spun around, heart hammering, but saw nothing but swirling frost and empty space. Panic twisted inside me as I realized the woods weren't just holding their breath. They were waiting. Something was stalking me, blending with the shadows, inching closer with every heartbeat. I scrambled for the door, but it slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping me in the cold, suffocating darkness. My breath hitched as whispers swirled around me, fragmented voices crying out in pain and warning. The line between reality and nightmare blurred. The fear was no longer just in my mind. It was alive, tangible, closing in. I forced myself to remember why I was here, to survive, to escape. But the shack wasn't just a place of death, it was a trap. And whatever hunted here was patient, relentless, and hungry. The shack was no longer just a shelter. It had become a cage, and something outside, or inside, was testing the bars. I clawed at the door, kicked it, until the hinges groaned, and finally slammed my shoulder against the frame hard enough for it to crack open. Snow burst in like smoke from a collapsing building, and I stumbled into the blizzard. The wind had changed. It no longer howled. It screamed high and sharp like something wounded and furious. The trees, gnarled and ancient, bent as though bowing to some unseen force. I didn't stop to think. I ran. The terrain I had passed through hours ago had shifted. Landmarks were gone. My boot prints vanished behind me before I could trace them. I pushed forward, lungs burning, ears ringing from the cold, and the voices I could still hear behind me, calling, begging, accusing. Eventually, I collapsed near a ridgeline where the wind broke against a wall of ice. I forced myself to crawl, behind a snow-covered boulder. That's when I saw it. Not a bear, not a wolf. Something taller, thinner. Human-shaped, but wrong. Its arms too long, joints bent the wrong way, moving in jerks like a broken puppet. It didn't make a sound as it dragged itself across the snow toward the shack. It wasn't alone. Two more appeared from the tree line, barely visible in the whiteout, stalking around the perimeter like they were herding prey. One of them turned its head toward me. No eyes, just smooth, frozen skin. But I swear it saw me. I didn't move. I couldn't breathe. They didn't chase me. They didn't need to. They knew the forest better than I ever could. Knew I'd eventually tire, wander, freeze. I think that's how the others died. Not from an attack, but from being slowly, perfectly broken down. But I still had one thing they didn't expect. I wasn't ready to die. Not yet. As the storm screamed overhead, I started crawling again, away from the shack, away from the bodies, away from the things that wore human shapes in the snow. I didn't know if I was escaping or just buying myself time, but either way, I wasn't going back. I don't remember how I made it out. Just flashes, ice burning my hands as I climbed down a ridge, my voice hoarse from screaming into a radio that never answered, blood dripping down my shin where something sharp tore, through my pants. The cold stopped hurting after a while. That's when I knew I was close to the edge. When I finally stumbled into a ranger station 2 days later, barely conscious and half frozen, they didn't believe me. Said it was exhaustion, hypothermia-induced, hallucinations. That I'd gotten lost, panicked, imagined the whole thing, but I remember the shack, I remember the bodies. I remember the way those things moved in the snow. Quiet, patient, and far too smart. No one ever found the place. Not on satellite. not on foot. Search teams said the area I described was sealed off years ago due to avalanche risks. But I know what I saw. I've got the frostbite scars to prove I was there. And some nights when the wind hits just right, I hear it again. That soft, dragging sound in the snow. Closer than it should be. If you ever find yourself deep in the Alaskan wilderness and you see a shack that isn't on any map, don't go inside, don't stop, don't even look, 'cause once it sees you, it never forgets. They say the Alaskan wilderness can swallow a man whole without leaving a trace. I used to laugh that off, chalk it up to campfire stories and tourist bait. But after what I found out there on the river, I'm not laughing anymore. It started 2 weeks ago. I'd taken some time off work, just needed space to breathe. I drove north, way past the towns, deep into the interior where the roads turn to dirt and the radio gives out. I wanted solitude, peace. That silence only snow and sky can offer. But on the third day, out near a frozen bend of the Copper River, I saw something under the ice. At first, I thought it was just cracks, natural from the way rivers freeze. But when I got closer, I realized they weren't cracks. They were symbols, carved. Perfectly straight, symmetrical lines cut into the surface from below. There were dozens of them, geometric shapes, circles crossed with lines, jagged marks like runes. Not random, not natural. Someone, or something, put them there. That was the moment things changed. I should have turned around right then, but I didn't, and I think something knew that. Something waiting just beneath the ice. The wind was brutal that morning, sharp, needling through my jacket like it wanted to flay skin from bone, but I barely felt it. I was kneeling on the river, gloves pressed flat against the ice, breath fogging up the inside of my scarf. My eyes traced each line, each impossible angle. Some of the carvings were old, barely visible beneath layers of trapped snow. Others looked fresh, like they'd been etched yesterday. But how? The ice was at least 4 inches thick, and even if someone had managed to carve through from below, there were no signs of tools, no footprints nearby, just a vast stretch of untouched white. I marked the spot on my GPS and made my way back to the truck. The engine took a second to turn over, which sent a little shiver of worry through me, but it roared back to life. I chalked it up to the cold. Back at camp, I pulled out my phone and snapped photos of the symbols. No service out here, of course, but I figured I'd reverse image search them when I got back. For now, I just stared at them, zooming in, trying to make sense of the pattern. One in particular kept catching my eye. A jagged triangle inside a circle, with what looked like 3 drops, or maybe flames, falling below it. There was something off about it. Not just in shape, in feeling, like my chest tightened every time I looked at it too long. That night, the temperature dropped hard, the kind of cold where even your breath feels solid. I bundled in layers, stoked the fire, and tried to distract myself with a paperback, but I kept thinking about the ice, about what was under it. Before bed, I stepped out to piss and take one last look at the river, and that's when I saw it. Something moved beneath the surface, fast, like a shadow swimming under the ice. I froze, breath held, waited. Nothing. Maybe it was a trick of light, the wind, my nerves. But the thing is, I wasn't near the symbols. I was standing almost 30 yards upriver, and still, something moved. That was the first night I didn't sleep. By the next morning, the fire had burned out, and the inside of my tent felt like a tomb. My boots were stiff with frost and my water jug was solid ice. But what bothered me most wasn't the cold. It was how quiet everything had gotten. No birds, no wind, just nothing. I walked back to the river, more cautious this time. The symbols were still there, only now they seemed more pronounced, like the ice had thinned overnight, pulling them closer to the surface. I crouched down and pressed my hand against it. It was warm, not a trick of the sun, there wasn't any. Thick clouds had rolled in, choking out the light, and yet the ice felt like skin under my glove. I jerked my hand back and stood up fast. Heart knocking in my chest, I needed answers. Back at the truck, I pulled out my emergency laptop and opened the photos. Still no signal, but I dug into the offline archives I'd downloaded before the trip. Old legends, native folklore, survival articles. Buried in a .pdf from a 1986 anthropology journal, I found something close. The symbols weren't random. They were protective wards, Tlingit in origin, but distorted, twisted. According to the notes, they were sometimes used near burial grounds or places considered cursed, places where the veil is thinnest, whatever that meant. I kept reading. Flipping through pages of oral history, there was mention of a black current beneath certain rivers, a flow of spiritual rot that drew lost souls and sometimes things worse. People who stayed too long near such sites were said to go silent, withdrawn, then vanish. I stopped, reading. Shut the laptop. Outside, the wind had picked up again, but it wasn't coming from the mountains anymore. It was rushing in from the riverbed. Sharp, wet. It carried something that smelled wrong, like old copper and rotted bark. I stepped outside and found fresh prints leading from my truck back toward the ice. Boot prints, not mine. They were deep, pressed clean into the snow, heading toward the river, but never returning. Just one set. No drag marks, no sign of slipping or struggle. It was like someone walked straight out onto the ice and never came back. And I realized I hadn't heard another engine for 3 days. I wasn't alone out here. Not anymore. That night, the ice cracked, not a pop, not a distant groan. A deep splitting sound like the earth opening its jaw wide and yawning straight through the river. I shot upright in my sleeping bag, heart punching my ribs. For a second I thought it was a dream, but then I heard it again. Crack. Closer this time. The kind of sound that makes your blood go cold because you know, no, it wasn't natural. I fumbled for my boots, didn't even lace them, grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent. The beam cut through the dark, landing on white snow and black trees. Silence. But when I turned toward the river, I saw the footprints again. More of them now. 3 sets, one larger than the others. They circled near the symbols, then vanished at the edge of the ice like they'd just stepped off the world. Then I noticed something worse. The carvings had changed. Where there had been symbols before, there were now holes, shallow but wide, as if something had clawed through from below. The runes were broken, fractured down the middle like shattered glass. The protective marks, gone. I backed away, careful with every step. But then I felt it. The ice shifted beneath me. My boot sank slightly, and a dark line spread out beneath. First I dropped to my knees, flashlight flicking wildly across the surface. Beneath the ice, something moved. Not just a shape, a figure. Pale, thin, human, maybe once. Its arms were stretched wide like it had been trying to claw its way up for centuries. Its face turned slowly and I saw its eyes, open, watching. I scrambled back and ran, slipping in, the snow gasping like I'd been holding my breath for days. I didn't stop until I hit the truck, slammed the door, and locked it out of reflex. The river behind me groaned again, not like ice breaking, like something rising. I tried to start the engine. Nothing, just the slow, dry whine of a dead battery. My hands were shaking too hard to hold the keys steady. I hit the dash, screamed into the cold, but the truck didn't care. And then I saw the fog creeping in, low, rolling in waves across the ground. It didn't touch the trees or my camp. It moved straight toward the river, and something was moving, inside it. I don't remember opening the door. 1 second I was staring through the windshield, frozen in place, and the next I was running. Back toward the forest, away from the river. But the fog. It was faster than I was. It didn't move like weather. It curled and darted like it had a will. It rolled through the trees, quiet and thick, swallowing my tracks as fast as I made them. Every sound felt muffled, like I'd stepped underwater. Then, I heard the voices, not out loud, inside, whispering beneath my thoughts. Fragments of language I didn't understand. rhythmic, repeating, like a chant. And the deeper I ran into the trees, the louder they got. I tripped. Face hit snow, knees cracked against a rock hidden beneath. Pain flared, but I barely felt it, because when I looked up I was back at the river, same bend, same symbols. But that's impossible. I'd been running away from it. The ice was fully cracked now, broken in wide starburst patterns around the largest symbol, and in the center a hole had opened, perfectly round, black as oil, like the river had been drilled into by something far below. The voices grew louder, then stopped, and from that pit, something climbed out. It wasn't fast. It didn't need to be. It was patient, tall and gaunt, its limbs too long, moving like bone wrapped in damp leather. No eyes, just smooth skin stretched over an angular skull. But it turned toward me like it saw me anyway, and I swear, I recognized it, not its face, but the feeling, like it had always been out here, waiting, like I'd heard its voice in dreams I couldn't remember, like I hadn't found it. It had called me. I turned and ran again, this time toward the only option I had left, the cliff edge a few hundred yards upriver. My legs screamed with every step, but I didn't stop. Not until I hit the ledge and looked back one final time. The fog had stopped. So had the creature. It stood at the edge of the cracked ice, head tilted, arms limp at its sides, like it had chosen not to follow. Like it didn't need to. Because I understood now. The symbols weren't meant to summon anything, they were seals. And I broke them. I never made it back to the truck. A rescue chopper spotted my camp 3 days later, after my emergency beacon finally kicked in. They found me half frozen on the ridge, mumbling nonsense, my face blistered from the cold. I don't remember calling for help. Don't remember climbing back up the cliff. Just flashes, branches, blood, fog that moved like it was alive. They said no one else was found in the area. No footprints, no signs of a second person. The photos of the symbols, gone. My camera's SD card was fried, melted somehow. They said it must have been battery leakage. But I know what I saw. They told me it was hypothermia, that I hallucinated, the whole thing. But I can't forget the way it looked at me. Not like prey, not like a threat. Like I was part of it now. I still hear the whispers sometimes, just under the static when I'm driving late at night or in the silence before sleep. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see the ice cracking open again. Only now, it's not in Alaska. It's under my house. And I know it's still waiting. Because once you've seen what's beneath the ice, it never lets you go. I never thought Alaska would get under my skin like this. I arrived at that tiny cabin way out past the last town's glow, alone, except for the endless wilderness and the biting cold. I was chasing silence, the kind only miles of untouched forest and frozen lakes can offer, away from the noise, the traffic, the world. But silence wasn't what I found that first night. Instead, faint voices crept through the walls, soft but unmistakable. They spoke in a language I couldn't place. A strange rhythm that was almost hypnotic. At first I thought maybe it was just the wind playing tricks or some radio signals from far away. But these voices didn't stop. They murmured beneath the creaks of the cabin, weaving around me like a thread pulling me somewhere I didn't want to go. I lay there frozen, heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But deep down I knew this wasn't just some background noise of the wild. It was something else, something alive. Something waiting. The night after those first voices, I convinced myself it was a one-time thing. Maybe some locals were out hunting nearby, speaking in a dialect I just didn't recognize. Alaska's got plenty of native languages and Old Russian, pockets. So I tried to shrug it off. But when the sun set again, the voices returned. Clearer this time, almost like a chorus drifting just outside the cabin walls. I sat by the small stove, trying to focus on the crackling fire. But those murmurs, wrapped around my thoughts, impossible to ignore. I pulled out my phone to check the time. It was past midnight, the darkest part of the night where every shadow feels alive. The cabin was tiny, nothing more than a weathered wooden box perched on stilts above frozen ground. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the window panes, but inside was something else entirely, something colder, almost like a presence I couldn't see. The more I listened, the more the voices seemed to shift, forming patterns I couldn't decipher but that felt urgent. I tried to remember every local story I'd heard about the region. Lost settlements, ghost towns swallowed by the snow, old legends whispered by native tribes about spirits trapped between worlds. I grabbed an old book I'd found in the cabin, a faded journal left by a previous tenant. There were notes about strange sounds, unexplained shadows, and warnings scrawled in shaky handwriting. Sleep was out of the question. Every time I closed my eyes, the voices returned louder, closer and more insistent, as if trying to pull me into their world. I stood by the window, staring out into the endless dark forest, wondering if whatever was speaking was watching me, too. The isolation that had promised peace was turning into something much darker, something alive in the cold Alaskan night that I couldn't outrun. By the third night, the voices weren't just background noise anymore. They started to feel personal, like they were reaching out directly to me. I caught snippets that weren't random anymore, repeated phrases or sounds that echoed, almost like they wanted me to understand. I grabbed my phone and started recording, hoping to catch a clear sample to analyze later. But every time I played it back, it was just as indecipherable, like a puzzle made of whispers. The language wasn't anything I'd ever heard. It wasn't English, Russian, or any of the native Alaskan languages I tried looking up. It was haunting, melodic, and at times urgent, like a warning or a plea. My skin crawled whenever I listened. The voices weren't just sound anymore. There were other things happening, small, unnerving changes inside the cabin. Objects shifted, places when I wasn't looking. The old lantern flickered though I hadn't touched it, and shadows moved just beyond the corner of my eye, vanishing whenever I tried to focus. I started keeping a journal, desperate to hold on to some grip on reality. But the deeper I went, the more the line between what was real and what was imagined began to blur. Sometimes I could swear I felt cold breath on my neck when no one was there. The isolation that once felt like freedom now felt like a trap, closing in with every whispered word. One night the voices grew louder, almost chanting. I stood frozen, my heart hammering, as the air turned frigid and the room felt heavy, like the weight of something unseen pressing down on me. I thought about leaving, but the snowstorm had settled in outside, blocking every road. I was trapped with whatever was haunting me. I wondered, were these voices remnants of lost souls? Or something older, something beyond human understanding? Whatever they were, they didn't want to be ignored. And I was starting to realize that this small cabin, so remote and forgotten, was at the center of something I couldn't explain, and maybe couldn't escape. Desperation pushed me to reach out beyond the cabin walls. I managed to get a weak signal and called a local ranger station, hoping someone could make sense of what I was hearing. The voice on the other end went quiet for a moment, then warned me not to ignore the stories locals tell about the whispering ones, spirits, bound to that land, voices of those lost to time, speaking in a tongue no outsider should hear. I brushed it off at first, but the hesitation in their voice sent a chill down my spine. I spent the next day driving to the nearest town, hoping to find an expert or at least someone who knew the area's dark history. The locals were tight-lipped, exchanging uneasy glances when I mentioned the voices. An old man at a diner finally leaned in, voice low and trembling, telling me about an expedition decades ago. Explorers vanished without a trace near where I was staying, and some say their souls were trapped in the wilderness, cursed to wander, unable to rest. That night, back at the cabin, the voices weren't just whispers anymore. They were desperate cries, shifting tones and rhythms that sent my mind racing. I felt like I was living through their final moments, caught in a timeless loop of fear and confusion. The shadows in the corners seemed thicker, watching, waiting. I tried to communicate back, speaking softly into the cold air, asking what they wanted. The voices responded with a broken, guttural phrase that chilled me to my core, something that felt like a warning or a plea for help. The air around me thickened, like the past was pressing into the present, refusing to let go. Sleep became impossible. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle outside felt like the ghosts were closing in. I was trapped between two worlds, the frozen wilderness outside and the invisible terror inside. I realized I wasn't just an observer anymore. Somehow, I was part of their story now, tangled in something far older and darker than I ever imagined. That fourth night was unlike anything I'd experienced. The voices didn't just whisper. They screamed, rising in a terrifying crescendo that shook the cabin to its foundations. I could no longer tell where the voices ended and the wind began. The language had a rhythm that felt urgent, desperate, as if they were pleading for release or warning me to run. The cabin seemed to breathe around me. Shadows stretched and warped, the wooden beams twisting into shapes I couldn't explain. I felt myself slipping, caught in a waking nightmare, where time bent and memories flooded in waves. Vivid visions overwhelmed me. Faces, some pleading, others angry. Blurred images of explorers lost in the snow. Native figures chanting in the cold, ancient rituals that felt alive despite the years. I stumbled outside, the freezing air hitting, my skin like a shock. The voices followed, no longer distant but right behind me, echoing off the trees in a haunting chorus. They weren't just sounds anymore. They felt like hands pulling at my mind, trying to drag me deeper into the forest, into their story. I tried to fight it, shouting into the cold night, demanding they leave me alone. But the voices only grew, louder, their unknown words wrapping tighter around my thoughts. The line between past and present blurred so completely I couldn't tell if I was awake or trapped in a nightmare. The isolation I sought was gone, replaced by a crushing sense of being hunted, by memories, by spirits, by something that refused to rest. As dawn approached, the screaming voices faded, replaced by an eerie silence so complete it pressed against my ears. I collapsed against the cabin wall, breath ragged, heart pounding like I'd run a marathon. Whatever had haunted me that night, it had changed me. I wasn't sure if I had escaped or if they had finally let me in. Morning light spilled through the frost-covered window, but the silence it brought felt heavier than the night's chaos. The voices had vanished, leaving behind a cold emptiness that gnawed at me. I packed my things slowly, each movement feeling hollow, as if part of me was still tangled in those whispered words and shadowed memories. The cabin, once just a shelter, now felt like a doorway to something I could never fully understand or escape. I left that frozen wilderness behind, driving away through the endless stretches of snow and trees. But the silence I had craved was gone, replaced by a lingering echo of those voices, an invisible thread pulling at my mind, a warning or a promise I couldn't decipher. I don't know what I was drawn into that night. Was it a trap? A plea for help? Or a curse tied to the land itself? All I know is, something touched me deep inside, something ancient and restless. And even now, miles away, I sometimes hear faint murmurs just beyond hearing, voices in a language I'll never learn, reminding me that some places hold secrets better left alone. I'd driven 12 hours straight through a snowstorm just to get there, and the cabin was exactly what I'd imagined. Quiet, isolated, a small dark shape surrounded by towering spruce trees and an endless white wilderness. The kind of place where no one would bother you because no one knew you were there. The cold hit me like a slap when I stepped out of the truck. My boots sank into untouched snow, and the only sound was the wind moaning through the trees, a hollow, lonely sound that made me shiver harder than the temperature. Inside, it smelled of old wood and ash. A single window looked out onto the forest, where the daylight was already fading, bleeding into gray. I set down my bag and crouched by the fireplace, stacking logs and kindling carefully, eager for warmth. But when I struck a match and watched the flames catch, they seemed weak, like they didn't want to burn. I chalked it up to damp wood, but less than an hour later the fire sputtered out completely. I rebuilt it. Twice. Each time the flames died faster than they should have. The cabin seemed colder than outside, as if the walls themselves were breathing frost. That first night was the kind of cold you feel in your bones, the kind that gnaws at you no matter how many layers you wear. I wrapped myself in 2 blankets and sat close to the hearth, watching the fire flicker low again. The logs were dry, I was sure of it. I'd stacked them myself, checked them in the shed, but the flames kept collapsing in on themselves, leaving only smoldering embers that barely glowed. The cabin creaked and shifted with the wind, old wood groaning like it was alive. Outside, the snow fell so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet beyond the window. Every gust rattled the glass and sent a shiver down my spine. I got up to relight the fire, striking matches one after another, growing more frustrated each time. It wasn't just that the fire wouldn't stay lit. It was how quickly the heat drained from the room, as if something was sucking it away. At some point, I went to the door to check the latch, just to be sure it was locked. That's when I noticed them, footprints in the snow, not mine. I'd parked close to the cabin and walked straight in, but these prints led from the tree line to the edge of the porch and stopped. No return tracks, no sign of anyone leaving. Just a set of impressions that looked shallow and strange, like bare feet pressed into the snow. I told myself it had to be old tracks, half filled by the storm, distorted by drifting snow. But when I turned back toward the cabin, I felt that prickling sensation on my neck, like I was being watched through the window. Inside, I tried to shake it off, forcing myself to focus on rebuilding the fire for the 3rd time. I arranged the logs carefully, lit them, and watched the flames climb for a few moments, flickering bright and warm. Relief settled over me for a second. But then, as if on cue, a sudden gust of wind rattled the walls, and the fire collapsed again, smoke curling up the chimney like a dying breath. It was past midnight now, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something didn't want me warm. By morning, the storm had buried everything in a thick, blinding white. My truck was just a faint shape under a mound of snow, and the sky hung low and heavy like a lid over the world. The cabin felt colder than ever, every surface biting to the touch. I made coffee on a portable stove, my breath fogging the air, and tried to convince myself it was all in my head. Fires go out. Wood can be damp. Alaska in winter is unforgiving. Simple explanations. But the unease gnawed at me and I needed answers. I started with the cabin itself, running my hand along the log walls. That's when I found deep claw marks etched into the frame near the door, almost hidden by the shadow of the porch. They weren't the scratches of an animal looking for food. These gouges were deliberate, long, and uneven, like someone had dragged something sharp across the wood. Inside, I checked the fireplace. The stones were blackened, but there were strange circular burn marks, patterns that didn't look accidental. It reminded me of something scorched into place, like a warning. The hairs on my arms stood on end, and I backed away, heart pounding. Stepped outside, crunching through the snow, scanning the tree line. No sound, no birds, no movement, just stillness so absolute it felt oppressive. A rusted axe leaned against the woodpile, and I grabbed it instinctively, more for comfort than necessity. The storm worsened by afternoon. Snow came down in sheets and the wind screamed through the trees. Escape was impossible. When the light faded again, I resigned myself to another night here, though every instinct screamed to leave. After dark, I tried once more to light the fire, but the flames barely lasted minutes. I wrapped myself in blankets, shivering violently, and that's when I heard it, something heavy dragging across the porch. I froze, clutching the axe, listening to the slow scrape and crunch. Whatever it was stopped just outside the door. I could see its shadow shifting through the slit of light at the bottom, a shape that didn't move like a person. The doorknob rattled once, softly, as if testing, and then everything went quiet. Didn't sleep. I sat in the dark with the axe across my lap, staring at the dead fireplace. Every few minutes, I'd light another match, trying to coax a flame to life, but it was useless. The cold had become unnatural, an invasive chill that seeped into my marrow, leaving my hands stiff and clumsy. I swore I could see my breath lingering too long in the air, curling and hanging like smoke. I shoved furniture against the door, the table, 2 chairs, even my duffel bag piled high. My breath came fast and shallow, every sound amplified, the hum, groaning of the cabin walls, the whistling wind squeezing through the cracks, the soft creak of the floorboards beneath my own weight. I lit a lantern, desperate for light, and that's when I noticed frost creeping up the inside of the window, forming intricate patterns like skeletal fingers. Something brushed against the window from outside. A shadow flitted past so quickly I almost thought I imagined it. But then I saw it again at the edge of the tree line. A figure, tall, motionless, watching. The lantern flickered as if in response, dimming until the cabin was swallowed in darkness. My heart hammered as I fumbled with the matches, my shaking, hands barely striking a flame. When I finally got one lit, I saw the frost on the window had spread, blooming across the glass like veins. The figure was gone. My mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe I was seeing things. Maybe it was exhaustion, or the isolation playing tricks. But I couldn't shake the stories I'd heard in passing before coming out here, from locals who said spirits roamed the Alaskan woods, stealing warmth from travelers who dared stay too long. By now, every muscle in my body trembled violently. My teeth chattered as if I'd been plunged into ice water. Even with the blankets piled around me, the cold clawed at me like a living thing. I dragged more wood into the fireplace, my movements frantic. I struck a match, praying for warmth. The fire sputtered, hissed, and for a moment flared. I leaned close, desperate for heat. Then it snuffed out instantly, leaving me in darkness so thick it felt alive. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I woke up to silence so deep it was suffocating. The lantern had gone out, and the air was colder than it had been all night. My breath came out in thick clouds, and when I reached for the axe, my fingers felt numb, stiff as wood. The fire was nothing but black ash now, the hearth stone cold to the touch. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Fresh ones, leading right up to my door, stamped clearly in the snow. My chest tightened as I realized there were no prints leading away. Something had come here, and hadn't left. A faint creak made me freeze. The sound came from the porch, then another, slower and heavier, like someone, or something, was pacing just beyond the door. My barricade shuddered as the doorknob turned with a soft click, then stopped. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might give me away. I gripped the axe tighter, every muscle tense, my ears straining for the slightest sound. A shadow passed over the window, pale against the frost, and I finally saw it. A face, or something shaped like one, peering through the glass. Its eyes were hollow pits, and its mouth was a dark slit, curling into something that might have been a smile. I stumbled back, knocking over a chair, and the shadow vanished. The door handle rattled again, harder this time. Then came a scraping sound as if claws were dragging across the wood, circling the cabin. The walls groaned as the temperature dropped even lower, the frost spreading over every surface, crackling, like brittle glass. My breaths came fast and shallow as I pressed myself against the far wall, clutching the axe with white knuckles, waiting for the inevitable crash of the door breaking in. But it never came. Instead, a long, drawn-out whisper curled through the cracks in the door, so soft I almost thought I imagined it, a sound like my name, stretched and distorted, echoing through the room. I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing my coat and the axe, I kicked aside the barricade and bolted out into the snow, running blindly through the blizzard away from that cursed cabin and whatever waited inside. I don't remember much of that escape, only the blinding snow and the sound of my own ragged breaths tearing through the silence. My legs carried me on instinct, stumbling and slipping, the storm clawing at my face. I didn't stop to think about direction. I just ran until the cabin was swallowed by darkness and trees. Somewhere along the way, my truck emerged from a white blur, half buried but still there. I clawed the door open with frozen hands and locked myself inside, shaking uncontrollably, the axe still clutched in my grip. I sat there for hours, waiting for daylight, jumping at every gust of wind, every shadow shifting beyond the fogged glass. When the first pale light of morning broke through the storm, I dared to look back toward where I thought the cabin was. It was barely visible through the trees, and what I saw made my stomach twist. There was no smoke, no sign of life, no footprints in the snow. It looked as untouched as the day I arrived. I drove away without looking back, hands trembling on the wheel. And I'll tell you this much. If your fire keeps going out in an Alaskan cabin, leave. It means you're not alone. I started driving the Dalton Highway just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, the sky bleeding orange and purple over endless stretches of barren tundra. Alone in my truck, miles from any town or soul, I felt that familiar mix of freedom and unease that comes with venturing into Alaska's wild heart. The road ahead was nothing but a narrow ribbon of gravel cutting through a vast, empty wilderness, and I knew I'd be the only vehicle for hours. That's when I first saw it. Something moving just off my passenger side, keeping pace with the truck like it belonged there, running alongside me in the fading light. At first, I thought it was a trick of the shadows or maybe a wild animal, startled by my headlights. But it didn't veer off or slow down. It just kept running, steady and relentless, as if daring me to look closer. My heart hammered as I stole glances through the window, trying to make out what it was. But the dusk swallowed most details. The creature, or whatever it was, moved, with a strange fluidity, too fast and too consistent for any normal animal. I wanted to believe it was just some moose or wolf, but a chill crept up my spine telling me this was something else. Alone on the Dalton with no help for miles, the realization hit me hard. I wasn't just driving through the wilderness, I was being followed, and it wasn't going to stop anytime soon. I could feel the tension building with every mile. At first, I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just an animal keeping pace, maybe spooked by the truck's headlights. But as the minutes dragged on, there was no breaking away. The shape kept running beside me, sometimes just in the shadows, sometimes clearer in the dim light. It was big, taller than any wolf I'd ever seen, but not quite like a bear either. The way it moved was almost unnatural, like it was gliding more than running, its limbs stretched and lithe. I remember gripping the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles whitening. I tried to keep my eyes on the road, but my peripheral vision kept pulling me back to that figure. The highway was completely silent except for the truck's engine and the crunch of gravel beneath the tires. No birds, no other animals, just that relentless presence beside me. Every time I glanced over, it was there, keeping perfect pace, never faltering. I thought about stopping, about throwing the hazards on and getting out to see what the hell it was. But something deep in me screamed not to. I didn't want to confront whatever was out there alone on that endless empty road. The sun was almost gone now and the creeping cold seeped through the cracked window. That's when I realized something even worse. The figure wasn't just beside me. It seemed to be matching my speed, almost daring me to speed up, to run. But where could I run to out here? I pushed the accelerator harder, hoping to leave whatever was running beside me behind. The truck roared louder, tires throwing gravel like shrapnel. But no matter how fast I drove, the thing stayed there, like it was tethered to my side. The darkness swallowed the landscape, and headlights barely pierced the night. Occasionally, the figure flickered at the edge of my vision, sometimes close enough to make out a twisted silhouette with limbs too long, too thin. It wasn't just running, it was pacing me, keeping up with ease as if it had no breath to lose. My mind raced back to stories I'd heard from truckers about strange sightings on this highway. Ghosts, cryptids, even something darker. I'd always laughed them off, chalking it up to isolation and exhaustion. But now, feeling the raw fear knot my stomach, I wasn't so sure. The cold seeped deeper and I felt a creeping weight on my chest like the night itself was pressing down. I glanced in the rearview mirror, nothing there but the endless dark road, and then back to the side window. The figure was closer now, moving with a strange rhythm, almost mocking me. I fumbled with my phone, desperate to call someone, anyone, but no signal. Alone, speeding down a desolate highway with something that shouldn't exist running beside me, I realized this wasn't just some wild animal. It was something else. Something that wanted me to know it was there. The seconds stretched out like hours as the figure stayed stubbornly at my side. Every instinct screamed to stop, to turn around, but the highway behind me was just endless black nothingness. I tried to convince myself to keep going, to make it to the next outpost, but the reality was I had no idea where I was anymore. The creature's presence wasn't just physical. It felt like it was messing with my mind, twisting reality in small, almost imperceptible ways. Shadows seemed to stretch longer, sounds muffled and distorted, and that cold weight on my chest grew heavier. At one point I caught a glimpse of its face, or what I thought was a face, pale, gaunt, with eyes that glowed faintly like embers. The sight froze me, heart pounding so loud I thought it might burst. It made no noise, just ran unwavering like some twisted guardian of the road. I couldn't tell if it was stalking me or if it needed me to follow it somewhere. Time lost meaning as I fought to keep my composure, every nerve screaming at me to stop looking, to focus on survival. I thought about the isolation of the Dalton. No cell service, no backup, no witnesses. It was just me and whatever this was, locked in this endless race. Somewhere in the distance, faint lights flickered, but every time I thought I was nearing safety, the darkness seemed to stretch further. The night had swallowed me whole, and with it this terrifying companion who refused to let go. I slammed my foot harder on the gas, heart hammering as the creature beside me seemed to match every acceleration. The road stretched endlessly ahead, but something about the way it moved felt deliberate. It wasn't just running, it was watching me, pacing me like a predator testing its prey. Shadows twisted under the dim glow of my headlights, and every now and then, a flicker of movement caught my eye, making my skin crawl. Then, just as I thought I might lose my mind, the creature did something unexpected. It slowed for a moment, almost as if it was trying to communicate, or warn me. Its eyes glowed brighter, two piercing embers in the dark, and a sound slipped through the night, a low, guttural growl, unlike any animal I'd ever heard. My grip tightened on the wheel as a wave of raw, primal fear crashed over me. I knew I couldn't outrun this. This wasn't a chase, it was a test. The miles blurred, my thoughts spinning, until I realized the highway was taking me somewhere unfamiliar. The landscape grew darker, the trees closing in tighter, and the feeling of being watched deepened. I had to decide. Keep driving into the unknown or stop and face whatever was out here with me. The choice wasn't mine to make. It felt like the creature was deciding for me, silently demanding I follow it into the dark. The lights up ahead finally grew brighter, maybe a small settlement or a gas station, but even as I pushed toward them, that thing kept pace, like it was tied to my fate. When I finally reached the edge of town, I slammed on the brakes, heart pounding, and dared to look beside me one last time. The figure hesitated, then vanished into the shadows without a sound, leaving nothing but the cold night air and my ragged breathing behind. I never saw it again, but the memory haunts me every time I'm alone on the road. The Dalton Highway isn't just a stretch of gravel and wilderness, it's a place where something waits, patient and relentless. I don't know what it wanted or why it ran beside my truck for miles, but I learned that out here, some dangers don't announce themselves with growls or screams. They just run beside you, silent and unyielding, until you reach the end of the road, or until they decide you don't.